What I want to do today is just sort of pull this together, and now that we've got some understanding of these factors that affect our emotional state, which is, to my mind, the big thing, there are some other really big lifestyle issues facing us. And so I'm going to get a little bit heavy with you at times today. But I want to focus in on what are the big well-being issues of the 21st century. Because we are actually facing really fascinating times. And, just I'll come to the point in a moment, but I'll tell you, my good mate, actually, has anyone seen the show Snap Happy? It's on Channel 10. Anyone seen that? It's just come out. It's a photography show. Anyway, the guy on it is my best mate growing up. We used to be in a swim squad together, and we were groomsmen at each other's weddings. And anyway, he's a funny dude. So if you see Snap Happy, his name's Jason Edwards. He looks a bit like an ape. And he's one of my mates. So anyway, he sent me this email the other day, and I opened it up, and the email was titled, "Why the 80s Had to End," all right? And so when you open up, this was the image in there, all right? And you know what? You can sort of look at that and go, whoa, what on earth is going on there? But what I can tell you is that was actually what looked good in the 80s. That, if you could get your hair like that, really sort of way up there, then you were considered sort of a happening thing. And I can actually this is a family photo. So, they've just had, now JC, you've had the second one, but they've obviously had their first, and they thought, the mumsy is thinking, I want to capture this moment in time, so that we've got something to remember our little happy family with our little happy gremlin in it. And so, and I can even imagine how, because we know how family dynamics play out. Mumsy's probably said to the guy, I don't know, Danny's probably his name, because that's an 80s name. She said, Danny, I want to have a family photo, so I want you home from work early on Thursday, because we're going to the photographer. And so Danny, reluctantly, oh man, I don't want this. But he comes home, and she goes, all right, Danny, go and make yourself look the best you can, So Danny goes in there and does his thing in the bathroom, and he comes out, and she goes, Danny, no, go back in there, get your hair up a little bit higher. Come on, I want us all looking our best. And what amazes me about this is, obviously they've gone and they've had these photos taken, and then they've gone back to the photographer a couple of weeks later when they're all on display, and she's looked through and gone, yes, that's the one I like. So she's picked this one. She's looked at that and gone, that's the one I want to illustrate. They'll capture that moment in a time. We can be so proud of. That's the first thing I want people to see when they walk through our door. And we just go, yeah, the 80s had to end, folks. The 80s had to end. The truth is probably that will come back one day. So, your kids will probably be sporting those sorts of haircuts and thinking they look cool again. But, there was a book written back in 1970, and 1970 was a great year, by the way, because that's the year I was born. But he wrote this book called Future Shock, Alvin Toffler. You wouldn't have heard of it before, but he said in 1970, he goes, you know what's going to happen? He said, things are speeding up so crazy fast, right? We're getting all these modern technologies, available to us and all the rest of it. That what's happening is the pace of life is changing so much that we're not going to be able to keep up with it. The future is going to be a shock to us, and it's going to create all these sorts of problems. And he, projected what would happen. Well, what I can tell you is that he was so far off the mark in terms of what he was thinking would happen by, say, the year 2000. And everyone was going, whoa, that's just like sci-fi, as if that would ever happen. Mate, we were so far beyond that by that time. And, I think about little illustrations of them. And this here is one of the first computers that came out. Actually, it wasn't one of the first computers came out, but in year 11, so when I was in year 1987, I remember going to the Melbourne Computer Show as part of a class, and this was it. This was the latest and greatest thing that had just come out. I think it was the Apple IIe or something or other, but because before that there was this thing called the Commodore 64. And the 64 related to how many K of memory it had. Not megabytes or, gig, it's how many K. And it was this little chrome screen that, was just did the most basic things. And everyone's just going, whoa, this thing's amazing when we saw this Apple IIe. Nowadays it's just ridiculous, the technology that we have. The fact that you guys can just have in the palm of your hand something that with a touch of a button you can talk to someone on the other side of the world. Or I could say to you, hey, what's the average lifespan of a yak? And you can go, which country, what breed of yak do you want to know about? right? This is just unbelievable, the way that technology is changing. There was a time when this was a mobile phone. It's not that long ago. This was the 90s. This was a mobile phone. And if you saw someone carrying that thing around talking on it, we called them a yuppie because they were a happening thing. They were up and comers. Because the previous model was this. You'd actually see people walking around with their battery pack and the receiver pack, and that was a mobile phone. Nowadays it got to the point where they got too small, and people couldn't push the buttons anymore, so they realised, we're actually better off scaling them back up a bit. And so we've seen the reverse, that these things start to increase in size. But see, what's going on though is because we've got this massive change in the way that we do life nowadays, our lifestyles are completely and radically changed. It is seriously staggering what has changed even in the past 15 years, even in the past 10 years. My oldest is 13, she can't remember life without the internet. Well, I can tell you, I remember a time when you didn't have mobile phones. I got my first mobile phone in 1999, which is only 17 years ago. And so, remember, nowadays it's just like, hey, if I don't have my mobile on me, it's just like you feel naked. You lost your second brain, and you wouldn't go on a long trip without a mobile phone, because what happens if you break down? Well, we used to break down in the past and we didn't have a mobile phone, so you'd have to walk for miles, or you'd have to wait till someone pulled over on the side of the road. The times are seriously and radically changing. So the way that we live life nowadays is radically shifted. And that is presenting some huge issues for us in terms of our well-being. And I want to talk about this morning just the big well-being issues of our time. And there's sort of two blanket umbrellas that they come under. And I'll tell you about the first one, we'll have a break, and then we'll talk about the second. But the first one basically relates to human well-being. All right, so we have some major issues relating to human well-being. We've spoken about one aspect of it. We've spoken about emotional well-being over the course of the semester. And I've given you some of the stats. I think I told you that if we look at, say, the use of antidepressant medications, they've gone up 100% in the past 10 years alone. We know that today about 1 in 10 adults are taking antidepressant medications. What's that indicative of? We know we're struggling here. There's some stuff going on here. But it's not just our emotional well-being, it's other aspects of our well-being too. In fact, the big thing that is really confronting us and facing us are these things that we call lifestyle-related diseases, right? These chronic conditions. And when I talk about chronic conditions, I'm talking about things like heart attacks. It kills about 1/3 of people. Do you know, going back 100 years ago, heart attacks were pretty much unknown. Hardly anyone died from them. And yet 1 in 3 people die from them today. Talking about diabetes. Right, diabetes, once again, literally pretty much unknown, go back 100 years ago, whereas today it's out of control. Probably it's getting up to 10% of people, adults, have type 2 diabetes. We know that has gone up by about 900% in the past 30 years alone. Right, so diabetes is a major issue. Things like cancer, we're seeing this. In fact, in some countries now, cancer is overtaking heart disease as the major killer. Things like chronic pain. This is a new one. We now know that about 20% of people over the age of 50 actually suffer this pain that just has no reason for being there, but it's just persistent and chronic and is completely debilitating. We actually are discovering, we've actually done a bit of research on this. It seems that it's actually an inflammatory thing that goes on in people's brains. So the pain, even though they feel it in their arm, it's actually not in their arm at all. It's actually these inflammatory processes in your brain that's caused by modern lifestyle that actually causes these things. Other things, you hear about this, but like sexual dysfunction. We actually know that one of the best-selling medications is actually Viagra, right? Because here's the stats, and I'm not saying it for this just to be funny, but over the age of 50, about 50% of guys now are impotent. Right, because of their lifestyle-related diseases. They actually say, here's the trends, 50% of guys over the age of 50 are impotent, 60% of guys over the age of 60 are impotent, 70% of guys over the age of 70. This is why no dude wants to live to 100. Right? So, these are major issues. These are coming through. What we've seen is this. If you look at the trends that are occurring here, is that chronic conditions, these lifestyle-related diseases, have actually just over the past 100 years particularly, and we're on the pointy end of the curve, are just going absolutely through the roof. What's intriguing is that, what's the cause of that? Well, I'm going to get to it, but pretty much it's our modern way of living that's causing the problem. Now, there are good things about progress and modern living, and that is that historically, what used to always kill people were these infectious diseases. So, the Grim Reaper came through. Pretty much, there was the Black Plague swept through, every third person died, and it just sucked. It was never much fun when the Black Plague went through. Or people got cholera, and all of a sudden, so these infectious type conditions, this is what people died of historically. Or they would break their femur, fall out of the cart, break their femur, and bang, you'd die from that. Whereas today, because of modern medicine, because of our modern ways, because of our technological breakthroughs, we have fantastic success stories here. What we've seen over the past, particularly 100 years, or say in 1928, antibiotics came on the scene so we could treat infections and bacteria. We got vaccinations so that we can actually vaccinate people, so that we've seen essentially the eradication of things like polio and measles and a lot of these things that would kill just millions of people. So these are fantastic success stories. And same deal, if you break your femur today, never a better time in history to break your femur, by the way. I'm not encouraging you to go out and do it, but never a better time because we have these technologies available to us. We have imaging techniques, we can set the bones, we can even just get you to hospital quickly. We can use a helicopter to get you there. We have great medications and drugs that can help with these sorts of things. So it's a fantastic success story of modern medicine and modern technology. We've seen a dropping away of acute conditions or things that come on quickly, but these chronic conditions are getting really out of control. I don't want to scare you, but I'll just show you this little thing here. See that little dip on the end of the graph? We are actually really frightened about what's coming up in terms of infectious conditions. Because what we know is that people haven't been using antibiotics properly. We know that when you take antibiotics, you take them, and what they do is they get into your system and they kill bad bugs, all right? They kill good bugs too, unfortunately, but they kill the bad bugs that cause our conditions where, a sore will get infected and then we'll die from it because it becomes septic. So antibiotics are a great thing, but what's happened is that people haven't been taking them properly. We take a few antibiotics and then we go, I think I'm okay now. But what happens is we don't kill the bugs. What we do is just make them stronger. And so, that when it comes to the world of bugs and bacteria, what doesn't kill them makes them stronger. And so we're actually breeding these superbugs. Not only that, we've been doing it in our food chain supply. So in the production of animal products like, say chickens and cows and that, the farmers dose them with antibiotics so they don't get sick. But the problem is then when we eat that, we have low doses of antibiotics that the bugs just learn how to manage and cope with. And so the frightening reality is we've got this thing now coming through which is called antibiotic resistance. And this is where we have these bugs that just don't respond to antibiotics. They're resistant strains. And so the forecast is, I do a lot of research with a guy based in the Lifestyle Research Centre at Avondale. They actually forecast that possibly within 20 years, we will no longer have effective antibiotics. And you know what? When that happens, man, we are looking at a completely radically different world. Back before antibiotics, if you went to war, you had 10 times greater chance of dying from infectious wounds or infectious conditions that you picked up there as compared to actual battle wounds, in battle. This is really scary, frightening stuff. So we're worried about what's going to happen. That's why that little curve there. Just to illustrate how bad this has got, these lifestyle-related conditions which are affecting our well-being, I want to show you some of the maps of obesity, all right? And we've all heard about, what we know is that lifestyle-related conditions, chronic diseases, are very much related or parallel changes in body weight. So we know that, things like diabetes, the biggest predictor of whether you have diabetes is if you increase your body weight. So body weight's a very big driver of this. And we hear about, there's this sort of obesity epidemic, and then you go, oh, really? There's always been, people that have, struggled with their weight. Is it really an epidemic? Is that sort of overstating a little bit too much? Well, I want to give you some maps here, just to illustrate what this really looks like. Okay, so here we go. This is for the United States. What this actually shows is the prevalence of obesity in these various different, in the various different states. The trends are much the same in Australia and many other developed countries. And so what you can see there is that in the white is, this is in 1985, by the way. This is the first time it was conducted. In 1985, what you can see is the white areas are where we didn't have data yet, and then the light blue ones are where between 10, the blue ones you can see is where between 10 and 14% of the population are obese in that particular state. So what I'm going to do is just flick through the years up to almost the present day, and then let's see what sort of changes we start to see. So here's 1986, 1987, 1988, 99, 2000, 90, 91. Now look at this. What they've just done there is introduced a new category, because now between 15 to 19% of that people in that state are obese. And this is not just overweight, this is actually obese. That's 1990, 91, 2, 93, 94, 95, 96, 97. Okay, new category there, where you can actually see is this new category, that orangey tinge, that's where over 20% of the people in that state are obese. That's 97, 98, 99, 2000, 2001. New category introduced, the red is over 25%, so 1 in 4 people of the people, not just overweight, are obese. 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005. New category, you see the dark red is where over 30% of the population are obese. 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, and that is where the last lot of data was collected. Isn't this interesting? So is there an obesity epidemic? Right? Is there any surprise that chronic conditions like diabetes is just completely out of control? No, we're actually seeing it. What's intriguing? What do you notice about that? What stands out to you about that map, that slide there?
There's not one place that has nothing.
Yeah, there's not one place that has nothing, but there's one place that's a long way behind the rest of the troops. And where is it? Does anyone know their geography? What state's that?
Colorado.
It's Colorado. Well done, Jace. Top of the class, Jason. Yeah, that there. Why is it that Colorado would have such a, comparative, still between 15 to 19% of so nearly 1 in 5 people are obese, but why would they have a lower prevalence than the rest of the country? Anyone know? Yeah, interesting. Well, who's been to Colorado? Great place to visit. They actually have some of their sporting institutes there, so it's actually, there is a very outdoor active culture. But not only that, do you know that Denver, which is like, sort of in the flatlands before you go up into the Rockies, is actually at 5,000 feet elevation. And what we know is that many people live up higher than that. I've actually been I've driven on the highest sealed road in America, which is over 12,000 feet. Right, and you get up there, and even just driving along, you're like, you can sort of feel it a little bit. But what they actually now think is that altitude affects this prevalence of obesity, because what we know is that when people, when you go up high and the air gets thinner, it actually changes your feeding behaviours. So the air actually influences how hungry you get. Right? And we know this, when people get altitude sickness as they get very high, they lose their drive to eat. They have to force themselves, otherwise they tend to lose a lot of weight. You know what's so intriguing about this is that there are actually studies now showing that we're seeing increases in the prevalence of obesity even amongst wild animals. Wait a sec, what's going on there? How could wild animals actually start to see increases in the prevalence of overweight and obesity? And the theory has it, and this is only just a theory, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, is that what do we all do? It's not like they're eating McDonald's, is it? It's not like they're sitting around, they still have to chase down their meals and all the rest of it. The theory is that possibly there's something in the air. Someone's strangling something. The theory is here that what might actually be happening is that the increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, which have sort of doubled in the last 50 years, may actually be influencing our feeding behaviours. We actually know that when you put someone in a laboratory room, even animals, and you increase the CO2 concentrations in the air, they start to change the amount they eat because it influences chemicals in our blood. Very subtle changes, but it actually influences us. So, air might make you fat is the takeaway message from this. So you know what? When you look at those maps,
What in America do they classify as obesity?
Okay, with a BMI over 30. So body mass index over 30. So you can do your body mass index. We've done it as part of class. It's a ratio of your height to your weight. So yeah, BMI over 30. If you have a BMI between 25 and 30, that's considered overweight. Over 30 is considered obese. Healthy is below 25 for most people. Unless you're really muscular male, then you can be a bit higher, obviously, and it's a muscle thing, which, Jace has major problems with that. So, guys, here's the reality of the world we're living in. This is issued by the World Health Organization, and this is what they say. This is in 2011. More people die today from being overweight than underweight. So we have over 1 billion people in the world today who die from the ill effects of overweight, and about 700 million, so 0.7 billion, people dying from starvation. So obesity is actually a bigger issue in the world today than is starvation. And you know what? That is the first time in history that has ever occurred. It's ever occurred. So, you ask the question, why is this? Why do we have this obesity epidemic leading to all of these chronic conditions that are making human well-being suffer so severely? And what you can actually do is map this back. There's a group of scientists, and they're called epidemiologists, right? And what epidemiologists do is they actually look at the cause of the causes. And so here's a little epidemiological map, right? And this is very well documented now. So, for example, we know that here at the end is obesity, and going along with that, all of these chronic conditions that we've spoken about. But why is there obesity? What's the cause of obesity? Well, you can step back one level, and what they say the cause of obesity is, we know, overconsumption, so too many calories in, essentially, and underactivity, right? So, we take too many calories in, and we consume too many, and we don't use enough calories. And so what you get is this calorie balance. You got too many of these things, your body stores that as adipose tissue or fat tissue. And we know that the reason your body does that is because throughout the countless, for the last several thousands of years, what's happened is the challenge for us has always been to get enough energy, right? And so when we did get enough energy, when we had an abundance of energy, we would feast in preparation for the next famine, because we would have famines. Whereas nowadays, we never famine, do we? When do you ever wake up in the morning and go, oh, stuff, our crops just got wiped out. We didn't have any food anymore. So it was an advantage for the human body to be able to store energy, and fat is just stored energy. But the epidemiologists then go, well, let's just step back one step further. Why is it that we overeat and we're not active enough? And what you find is that it's because we can. We actually live in a world today when you can do that. And I like this sign, this McDonald's sign. McDonald's, over 99 billion people served, and there's the drive-through. It epitomises this for us. What it's saying is that, hey, we have on tap a ton of calories for you guys, and you don't even have to get out of your car to get it. So we live in this environment, this world, where we are set up for failure when it comes to, say, managing body weight. And I think this is a really important message, because what I want to tell you is that overweight and obesity are not character flaws. They're not, it's not because people are gluttons, or it's not because they're lazy, or, it's because we are just set up for failure in this regard. And yes, we need to take personal responsibility for this kind of stuff, but we live in a world where we are set up for failure, right? The reason we overeat is because we can. The reason that we don't move is because we can. Not only we can, we actually are encouraged not to, by things like that. And we see in every aspect, we have technologies, they drive us around. We don't have to use our legs anymore to walk from place to place. We have food production systems, which are just all geared up. But the epidemiologists go one step further back than that. They said, well, why do we have this modern environment where there's an abundance of, highly processed, energy-dense foods and we don't have to move more? And at the end of the day, what it actually comes back to is economic growth. This idea that we need to get bigger and better and progress, at a faster and faster rate. Right? This whole idea of economic growth, epidemiologists know, is actually the downstream effect is actually the cause of human poor well-being, human ill health. Does that sort of make sense? I want you just to grasp that concept. We're going to break for a moment because then I'm going to come back and what you're going to see is there's a recurring theme here. So this whole idea of economic growth, is economic growth a good thing for the country? You listen to all the politicians, they say, absolutely, we need faster economic growth. The more economically growing and moving ahead our country is, the better the place is to live. But you know what? People are starting to question that now because we know that economic growth, that insatiable want for bigger and better and more, actually down the chain starts to cause huge problems with human well-being and human health. In fact, if you look at the maps, you can actually show that bottom curve there. As economic growth goes up, it mirrors changes in people's chronic conditions, in their lifestyle-related diseases. All right, I want to pause there for a moment. Yeah. Okay, I'll tell you that. This is what we know, is that probably the sweet spot in a society is right there, and it's what they call it, it's actually called the epidemiological transition. And what it represents is that the spot where you can actually do the statistics on a community and see when is it that more people start to die from chronic diseases as compared to these infectious diseases. Where does that crossover take place? And where that crossover takes place, they call it the epidemiological transition, and they believe that that's probably the sweet spot of a community. Because what's happened is you've got enough technology, enough innovations to start to curb these, all these infectious, you've got enough good modern medicines, you've got enough technologies to care for human health and mitigate a lot of these acute conditions. But what's happened is the modern technologies that haven't got so out of control that people aren't moving, they're eating too much, that, the chronic conditions are getting out of control. So that little smiley face, they actually believe, is potentially the sweet spot of a community, of a civilization. What I can tell you is that in China, that epidemiological transition took place in 2006. In India, it took place in about 2010. In Australia, it took place probably in the 1980s. Now, what the forecasters say, what the economists and the epidemiologists say, is that they actually believe there's a tipping point. And what actually will happen is that when things get this out of control, like we're seeing, we're on the pointy end of, it's just going up. Chronic conditions are just going crazy. What they actually believe is that maybe the whole system sort of starts to fall apart a bit and eventually brings itself back to that sweet spot, to that epidemiological transition. In other words, the communities are forced to go back to live like they did when that sweet spot occurred. So, some of these forecasters would say that what will happen for us in the long term is that our way of living, our lifestyles will return back to probably like we used to live in the 1970s and 80s. What was life like back then? Well, many people had gardens in their backyard to supplement their food supply. If you got a tear in your jeans, you'd sew it up as compared to going and buy a new set. So there are theories that that's the way things will go. And we'll be forced to do it because not many of us will choose to do it. So, interesting times.